Hello, I'm Mary Napper-White, and welcome to my final video in the community group Folks Kindful Cafe project, sharing the folklore of Shropshire. So it's very appropriate this time to be looking at harvest customs. And we'd love to hear your memories and images and comments to add to our store of folk traditions. This video is going out just before the ancient pagan feast of Lughnasadh, or the Christian version, which was Lammas. And the word Lammas derives from the Anglo-Saxon meaning loaf mass, and it was a celebration of the first bread to be baked from the new grain harvested that year. Traditionally, this was the start of the harvest season, although nowadays, with the introduction of winter wheat and faster growing crops, harvest has got earlier and earlier. And of course, it's not just the grain harvest that is important. Vegetables and fruit at midsummer, including whinberries from the Shropshire hills, and the apple harvest in the autumn, are all part of the harvest season. But it was the harvesting of the main food crops of wheat and other grains that was particularly associated with ritual and custom. We tend to think of harvest customs as Victorian, but the great Shropshire folklorist Charlotte Byrne, in her celebrated 2-volume Folklore of Shropshire, published in 1883, remarks that nothing has undergone a more complete and more recent change than has the ingathering of the harvest since the introduction of reaping machines some 20 years ago. She talks of the old customs of farmers and labourers helping each other out by reaping each other's crops as declining by the 1820s, and the customs of cutting the gander's neck and crying the mare were in decline by the 1850s. And the communal harvest suppers, paid for by the farmers, were fast becoming things of the past. So what were these pre-mechanization customs? When corn was cut by hand, the harvest was a shared activity for almost everyone in the rural community. If one farmer was having particular difficulty getting in his crops, his neighbours would help, and he would reciprocate if needed. If the blacksmith or the tailor took a day off to help with the harvest, they might expect that in the winter the farmer would send a wagon and horses to help lug coal. Ancient taboos relating to the spirits of corn and land meant that the harvesting of the last sheaf standing was a particularly significant time, and the responsibility was usually shared between the reapers, who would stand around the sheaf and throw their sickles at it. And this was cutting the gander's neck. And the man who did so would carry the sheaf back to the farmhouse, where the farmer's wife would keep it safely until the following year's harvest. Near Bishop's Castle and in many other counties in England, the reapers were drenched with water as they carried the sheaves home. And in some places, the reaper of the neck was roughly handled and bundled up in the sheaf and rolled on the ground. This was perhaps, just perhaps, a memory of rather more sinister customs from the deep and ancient past. And why gander's neck? Well, a goose was traditionally served at the harvest supper. It was often the women who stood on top of the carts with pitchforks loading up the sheaves of corn. And to overthrow a load was a disaster which could result in the goose not being served at the supper. In Newport in 1884, it was reported that Mr. B's men han lost the goose first load. In Shropshire, at least, cutting the neck was a separate custom from crying the mare, which was a way of advertising that one farmer's harvest was completed and spurring on the neighbours by pretending to send the old mare to help the laggards out. It was a time of much shouting and hilarity and fun. At Longnaw, up until about 1850, the leading reaper was mounted on the best horse in the team, both horse and man being arrayed with ribbons, streamers, etc., and led in triumph to the neighbouring farmhouses. And Charlotte Byrne notes that at the time she wrote, it was still the custom in the Stretton Valley for a loud cheer to go up when the last load reached the farmyard, to let the neighbours know. Finally, although not specifically mentioned by Charlotte Byrne, there was the custom of gleaning, when women and children were allowed into the fields to gather up the leftover grain. For the poor, this was an important and closely guarded privilege. And of course, the subtitle of Byrne's book is A Sheaf of Gleanings. So, thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this series of brief glimpses into some aspects of the folklore and traditions of Shropshire. Please watch out for future projects celebrating the legacy of our wonderful women folklorists. Goodbye.